Graham.
Thank you. Before lunch, we were looking at the adequacy or the effectiveness of the
Yes.
investigation, and I was asking about a number of areas that could possibly be gathered under that topic generally. I'd like to ask you about the taking of some witness statements.
Yes.
And for your comments on that. First of all, I think you mentioned this at paragraphs, well, starting with 380 of your inquiry statement. And you were asked to comment on one statement that had been taken by PIRC investigators from DC Derek Connell. We've heard his name in the inquiry as the officer who located the knife
Yes.
at Hayfield Road. And a statement was taken on the 6th of May in the presence of DS Samantha Davidson. And we've also heard that Samantha Davidson was in attendance at Hayfield Road on the 3rd of May. PIRC took statements from Davidson on 29th of May and 2nd June, and I have been asked if I was aware that the statement taken by PIRC from Connell was in the presence of Samantha Davidson. And you say, no, I wasn't. That wasn't best practice. I would like to interview these officers individually, get their account in their words, without anyone else being present, who might be asked similar questions at a later date, because it's their account that we want, their honestly held belief, not something that they may have heard from someone else. Can I ask you to expand on that, please?
Just that, I do not think, and I don't see how it could be considered to be best practice to note a statement from any witness, police officer or otherwise, in the presence of someone else who may also be a witness in that investigation, for the reasons that I give there, that it's their recollection, the individual's recollection. You don't want that spoken about in front of someone else who may very well be a witness soon.
What are the risks if another witness speaks about their recollection in front of another individual who was a witness?
Purely and simply that it may very well impact on their recollection of the events, that they repeat what they hear from that individual or are swayed by what they hear from that individual rather than relying on their own memory.
We've heard that officers involved in the restraint of Mr. Bio and the interactions with him did not give statements until the 4th of June.
Yes.
So in early May, when statements were being taken from witnesses, was it seen as even more significant or of any more significance that they were to be interviewed separately?
I just think as a matter of course they should have been interviewed separately. Whether it was more important before or after, no, quite straightforward as far as I'm concerned. It shouldn't have happened in the first place.
Right. And do you understand PIRC's approach to these witnesses? We've heard that they both attended at Hayfield Road.
Okay.
They obviously gave statements and were willing to give statements. Other officers were not until later. Was there any view taken in PIRC about how these witnesses should be approached, other than the fact you would have interviewed them separately?
In respect to arranging for the statement to be taken?
No, in respect of asking them detailed questions about what they saw, who was doing what, if they were aware of any of that. Were they seen as important eyewitnesses or potentially important eyewitnesses?
I think
not?
everyone has to be considered important because you don't know what they're going to tell you. So you need to approach it with the mindset that they may have information which is relevant and important.
Thank you. And then at 381, you were also asked to comment about PIRC investigators taking a statement from Alan Finlayson, who was a paramedic
Yes.
involved that day. You say that I've been informed that on the 26th of May, PIRC investigators took a statement from Mr. Finlayson, who's a paramedic involved in the response to the incident on the 3rd of May. I have been referred to Mr. Finlayson's statement to the inquiry, in which he states with reference to PIRC investigators, they were really quite snippy and quite arrogant about the whole thing. It didn't start off well, that meeting. There was a lot of bad feeling. I was under duress to provide evidence from a statement that technically I shouldn't even have had in my hand at the time. I'm interested in any reflections you have on his comments, Mr. Finlayson's comments, about the investigators being snippy, arrogant, and there being a lot of bad feeling.
Very disappointed if that's how Mr. Finlayson felt about the investigators. Disappointed.
And in terms of your expectations of your investigators when they were taking statements, what did you expect investigators to, how did you expect them to act when they were taking statements?
Well, I would expect them to tell the witness who they were, what the intention was, and then to be courteous to the individual whilst taking the statement.
Thank you. And then look at 382, please. You were informed that on the 27th of May, PIRC investigators took a statement from James Hume, who was a friend of Mr. Bio. Within his statement to the inquiry, Mr. Hume states he was asked by PIRC investigators if Sheku Bio took drugs, drank alcohol or took steroids, and if Mr. Bio was an aggressive person who became involved in fights. I've been referred to Mr. Hume's inquiry statement in which he states, I just felt really uncomfortable. It was definitely leading questions, and it felt like accusatory rather than fact-finding. It was like they had a picture built up and they were just confirming what they already thought with me. Again, do you have any reflections on that comment? Perhaps we should maybe go down the page slightly, actually, because it goes on. It built up a wee bit mistrust towards PIRC and the police just because of the way that went. Then can we move up? Then it's the next paragraph, and you say, I'm disappointed if that's how the witness felt. Looking back now, would you have had higher expectations of your investigators?
Yes.
And what would you have been expecting your investigators to do with Mr. Hume, a friend of Mr. Bio?
Well, I think to get relevant information from Mr. Hume, information which may assist the inquiry. Now, I think by that stage we were aware that Mr. Bio had indeed taken drugs, and I'm not so sure that the questions themselves were inappropriate. It appears to me more that the way that they were put to the witness, he felt was inappropriate.
Would you have expected your investigators to provide, as you say there, a better explanation, perhaps a fuller explanation?
I think that could have eased matters, yes, had they better explained why they were asking these questions.
Looking at those descriptions from Mr. Finlayson and Mr. Hume, and Mr. Hume's expression that it built up a wee bit of mistrust towards PIRC, do you have any concerns about how this would impact on the investigation?
I think, in fairness, I would have to know more about what happened that day and what the great concern was. I was unaware of this at the time. If this had been brought to my attention or to a member of staff attention, I would certainly have spoken to the investigators involved and made them aware that I expected better.
Right. And was there a process in PIRC at that time that allowed people to raise concerns with you or a senior member of PIRC?
Yes, people could complain. Yeah, by lifting the telephone, they could complain.
Can I look at another paragraph in your inquiry statement, please? 263. And this relates to DC Andrew Mitchell, and you were referred to a statement obtained by PIRC on the 2nd of June. So this is still prior to the officers giving statements. He was involved in passing the death message to Mr. Bio's family.
Yes.
You say, I've been informed that within that statement, DC Mitchell does not appear to have been asked to respond to the allegations made by Mr. Bio's family in relation to the information that was passed to them on the 3rd of May, and no further statement appears to have been obtained from DC Mitchell after PIRC's terms of reference were expanded on the 12th of June. Just so it's clear, the expansion on the 12th of June asked PIRC to investigate the family's concerns about misinformation and different versions being given. So that was expanded in terms of reference on the 12th of June, and it would appear that no one went back to DC Mitchell to ask him about that. He gave a statement on the 2nd of June, but not after that. And you say, I've been asked if I would have considered it best practice for a further statement to have been obtained from DC Mitchell to cover this. I would have thought so, yes.
Yes.
And why do you say you would have thought best practice that would have been done?
Well, I think we should have considered what DC Mitchell had said in his first statement. We should have compared it to the complaints that the Bio family were making. We would have identified then whether or not DC Mitchell had covered these points, and if not, the correct course of action would have been to go back and re-interview him.
Can you explain to the Chair how it is that things like this don't fall through, so that things are picked up? How do you go about that, and how did you go about that in PIRC?
Again, that a role that the senior investigator will play is to read all of the statements that are relevant to his lines or her lines of inquiry. And I would have expected that to be picked up at that stage.
Would you expect the senior investigator to do some sort of comparison to see, here are my terms of reference from the Crown, here are the actions that are being done in relation to investigating those, and is anything more needing to be done?
Yes, because I think you need to be able to answer the questions that the Crown have asked.
And is it an expectation that ultimately in the report there will be answers given to each of the lines of investigation?
Well, I would think that Crown would have an expectation that the direction that they had given would be covered in the report.
Thank you. And obviously, we've heard evidence from DC Andrew Mitchell. He was one of the officers who passed the death message. Would it be obvious that the officers who passed the death message would be key witnesses to that line of investigation?
To that line of investigation, most certainly, yes.
And then I can move on to 264. I knew that Gary McEwen did meet with the family. My understanding is that Gary McEwen knew the family in some way through some local initiative. He decided, as no flows had been there, that he was going to go and give the family an update as to where they stood at that moment in time. Then we can move on to the next page. 265. I've been referred to the statement obtained by PIRC from Chief Superintendent Gary McEwen on the 24th of June. So this is after the officers have given statements. After PIRC's terms of reference were expanded on the 12th of June, I have been informed that the allegations made by the family about the information passed to them on the 3rd of May do not appear to have been put to Chief Superintendent McEwen within this statement. The allegations only appear to have been put to Chief Superintendent McEwen in a subsequent statement obtained in January 2018. So not quite 3 years later, but almost.
Considerable time later, yes.
And that was at the Crown Office direction.
Yes.
We've heard that by this stage Crown Office had a report from PIRC.
Yeah.
Again, that's a purely operational decision that would be made by the senior investigator. I didn't read absolutely every document. That is left to the senior investigator to progress the investigation.
Yes.
So is it fair to say that this is something you would have expected the senior investigator to be keeping an eye on?
Yes, again, if clarity was needed, I would expect that decision to be made and to be pushed through by the senior investigator.
So given the family's concerns that were raised by the Crown's letter on the 12th of June about what they were told on the 3rd of May, the different versions, the misinformation, and knowing that Chief Superintendent McEwen went to visit the family and was one of the people who was passing information to them on the 3rd of May, would you have expected the senior investigator to go back to Chief Superintendent McEwen after the 12th of June, after the letter from the Crown Office, and asked further questions?
Yes.
Thank you. I've put a series of issues about statements not having been obtained or further statements not having been obtained in relation to specific matters. In terms of thinking again about adequacy of the investigation and effectiveness, do you see those as examples of maybe where PIRC have not been adequate or effective in the investigation?
Examples of where things could have been done better.
Thank you. We've heard evidence about the police officers giving statements.
Yes.
So as I understand the position, on the 2nd of June, contact was made and officers agreed to provide statements.
Yes.
The arrangements were made for them to come for the majority to Scottish Police College.
Yes.
And to give statements on the 4th of June.
Yes.
And in between that time, there was a witness interview strategy prepared. Now, I don't know if you've seen any of the questions I've asked Mr. Little and Mr. McSporran about that.
No.
All right. I think in your statement you say you weren't involved directly with preparing the witness interview strategy.
No, I certainly wasn't, no.
Can we look at paragraph 356 of your inquiry statement? I have been asked if, in an interview following an incident, I would consider it important to ask why certain decisions were taken by the officers. Yes, an awful lot is to do with justification. So that would be a natural question under that circumstance. Why did you find it necessary to use CS spray? Justify your actions. Even without using the term justify your actions, tell me why you felt it was appropriate to use a baton. Why did you find it necessary to use handcuffs? I'm quite sure all these questions were asked. I'd be surprised if they weren't. We've heard evidence that police officers are, in the UK, police officers are permitted to use force.
Yes.
In their daily work. And they have a legal right to use that. But in order for that to be legal, they must justify each and every individual use of force.
Yes.
And it's justified by the officer explaining why that use of force was necessary, reasonable and proportionate.
Definitely.
And they must use the minimum level of force that they can
Yes.
to achieve their objective. So when you're talking here about asking justify your actions, is it against that background about the legitimate use of force?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Now, you've said here you're quite sure all these questions were asked and I'd be surprised if they weren't. I don't want to take you through the witness interview strategy in detail, but we have gone through that with other witnesses, and there aren't any questions where they've specifically written down justify why you used force, justify that use of the baton or the spray or whatever use of force it was. There are no questions such as tell me why you felt it was appropriate to use a baton or a spray. No questions why did you find it necessary to use handcuffs. Presumably that surprises you to hear that.
Yes.
Now, if you take from me that that's the evidence that we've heard, do you have concerns that none of those questions were put in a witness interview strategy?
I think those questions should have been asked.
Why?
Because as you explained there, we have to understand why force was used. We need to understand that if it was used, that it was the minimum required, that it was appropriate, and it could be justified.
Now, in the interviews of the officers, they were giving their recollections, their version of what happened from their perspective. Would you have expected your investigators to probe into that further, into their recollection, and to ask questions about why did you use force at that point, if the officer is simply explaining the whole circumstances?
Yes, I would have thought that there should have been challenges or further investigation of the answers that were given. I thought that would have been fair.
Are you able to explain what was happening with the PIRC investigation at that time? We've heard that the witness interview strategy was prepared by a Mr. Sinclair.
Okay.
He had training, he had experience in preparing witness interview strategies.
Yes.
And obviously we're talking about a period between the 2nd and the 4th of June. We've heard evidence that he may have felt that there was not a lot of time to prepare witness interview strategies during that window, and that I wonder your views about that period of time being given. Obviously, they've been waiting for statements, but what's your view about expecting all of that to be done and prepared for in a window between the 2nd and the 4th of June?
Yes, I think that would be a challenge for the interview advisor. There was by now an urgency to get statements from these officers. Now, that doesn't mean that it's all going to be covered in one interview. What I believe that you're describing here is a situation where they are asked to provide their account without any great challenge to that. That surprises me. And in sort of the 2 to 4 days was a short period of time, but there was a real urgency to get statements from these officers due to the passage of time.
Would you have, you've talked about a challenge, would you have expected that probing to have been done on the 4th of June?
Without actually reading the whole content of those statements at this stage, or understanding exactly what was being said and what kind of questions were being asked, what I would say is that if it hadn't been asked at that stage, and then statements had been read and it was felt that they hadn't adequately been covered, I would have expected people to be re-interviewed.
And when you say adequately covered, if there was, say, an example of an officer describing a use of force,
Yes.
where there did not, on the face of it, appear to be a full explanation or justification given, in that, given that you've agreed they have to justify every
Yes.
single use of force, would you have expected that to be covered
Yes.
on the 4th of June?
Yes.
And in the absence of that explanation, if someone reflected later on the statements, would you have expected investigators to go back to ask those follow-up questions?
Yes.
And in relation to the time period between the 2nd and the 4th, given what you said about urgency, would there have been any reason, or was there a reason not to delay slightly arranging statements from the officers?
I think maybe a fear that the offer would be withdrawn.
Right. Thank you. You've mentioned the M9.
Yes.
And we've heard evidence that that was a significant investigation which also came in.
It did, yes.
My understanding is it happened in early July, 5th of July. So within a matter of
Yes.
months, 2 months
Yes.
of the death of Mr. Bayo. Do you remember the specific impact that investigation had on the resources which were working on Mr. Bio's inquiry?
Yes, clearly resources had to be provided to the investigation into N9, so clearly it had a detrimental effect on the timing, etc., of the inquiry into Mr. Bio's death.
Do you remember now the impact on the numbers that were working?
Again, the way that we tried to manage that was to look at the workload that was ongoing each and every day. Look at the priority level for each of those investigations. And then I'm afraid it was a matter of robbing Peter to pay Paul and moving staff around to best meet the needs of the priorities on that day, based on the finite resources.
So is it fair to say that from the date that happened, that some staff were relocated to the other investigation from Mr. Bio's?
And from other investigations that were ongoing, because those weren't the only two investigations that were ongoing at that time.
And do you remember the sort of numbers we're talking about, or do you have a sense?
It wouldn't be a part of turning around saying, right, we're going to half the numbers and give equal numbers to each inquiry. It would be, what investigations do you intend carrying out today, tomorrow, and how many people would you need to make sure that you can do that? Would that inquiry then get all of the people that were asked for? Well, maybe not, simply because everyone thinks their inquiry is more important than the other. And on occasions, I or Irene Scullion would have to step in at that stage and say, I hear your plea, however, this inquiry needs that done as well, so this is what you're getting, and come back to me and give me a progress report.
And so after the period, say on the 5th of July, when the M9 situation rose, was there a sort of daily review undertaken to best allocate the resources that were available?
There was a daily review in the entire time that I was at the PIRC to ensure that the finite resources were pointed in the right direction to achieve what had to be achieved at that time.
Right. Now, when this is ongoing, we've heard that just a few days prior to the M9 incident, on the 2nd of July, we've looked with Mr. McSporran at a letter that the Crown sent to Mr. McSporran, where the Crown said they would confirm that they would take responsibility for instruction of appropriate experts in relation to positional asphyxia, or asphyxiation,
Okay,
as the
yes.
letter said. Was it the normal course of events that Crown would take responsibility for instruction of experts?
I don't recall in my experience that occurring, but if they were aware of a specific specialist, they may very well decide to do that themselves or direct the PIRC investigator to take on that role.
Can we look at paragraph 537 of your inquiry statement, please? And I'd like to ask you about some questions about instruction of experts.
Yep.
Just to put this into context while we wait for it to be brought up on the screen, officers have given statements on the 4th of June. There was an interim report sent from to Crown on the 7th of August.
Okay, yes.
And at that point, very shortly after the 7th of August, the PIRC instructed two experts, Payne James and Dr. Karch.
Okay.
So that's the evidence we've heard.
Okay.
So 537, I have been asked what personal involvement I had in the identification, selection and instruction of expert witnesses by PIRC during the investigation. Very little, to be quite honest with you. I've let the others do the research into that, and part of that research was for people who we identified, who we thought might be able to help, to provide the CVs to support their area of expertise. Details of those identified and their CV were shared with Crown to see if Crown agreed that we were in the right direction and approaching the right people.
Yes.
I'm interested in this process that was followed through. We've heard from Mr. McSporran that he had much experience of instructing forensic experts, both as a police officer and in relation to other investigations. I'm interested in this investigation, this part of the investigation where medical experts were being instructed. And it would appear that investigators from PIRC were researching who to instruct. Can you tell me a little about that from your perspective?
Well, just that. They looked at where we could identify experts who may have the specific skills to comment on the areas relating to death, the effect of alpha PVP, the effect of MDMA, the effect of these drugs together on Mr. Bio, the effect of restraint on Mr. Bio. It also went further and looked at training in relation to use of force. So ultimately, it was a broad look across the area of expertise, and there is a library, for better term, held within, now I think I said initially the crime faculty, I think it was the College of Policing, ultimately, who held a library of experts who had been used in previous investigations. That's how the library was built up, and who could support their knowledge and expertise through providing CVs and papers, etc. However, this was me. I didn't think it was appropriate for us just to march ahead and consider that we had identified people that the Crown would consider as the right people. So it was shared with Crown for their opinion as well.
Right. So rather than simply instruct once you'd identified the expert,
Yeah.
you sought the approval of Crown?
Yes, we sought agreement with Crown, I would say.
Was this reliance on the College of Policing because PIRC didn't have its own resources in terms of identifying experts? And
Yeah, no, we didn't. And, you know, that type of information previously has been gathered largely during police investigations. An expert witness library, as I called it, has been held for a number of years and is added to as more expertise in different areas becomes available.
And was this, there was no opportunity to ask Crown for guidance about the identification of the expert?
Well, I think in referring our thoughts to Crown and telling them who we intended to approach, that had they had any ideas that that would have been the time that they would have volunteered those. I mean, that was an ongoing discussion around the expert witnesses.
Can we look at paragraph 541? You say, I have been asked if this was the only investigation I'm aware of in which PIRC instructed expert witnesses. Yes, I'm sure it is.
From my knowledge in the time I was there, I don't recall another set of circumstances. I may be wrong, but I do not recall another set of circumstances.
So from the 1st of April 2013, when PIRC were created, you were there, you were
Yes.
director. Up until the 3rd of May 2015, when the incident happened with Mr. Bio, you're not aware of ever being instructed by the Crown to instruct expert witnesses?
No, I don't recall.
So if expert witnesses were required, was it the Crown who took on that responsibility?
No, the senior investigating officer did.
So had there simply just never been an investigation that required the instruction of experts,
That's my understanding, yes.
rather than the Crown would instruct experts?
No,
but
no, no,
they
I have
changed
no knowledge of that happening, no.
And after May 2015, were you aware of any other investigations in which PIRC were instructed to instruct expert witnesses, identify and instruct expert witnesses?
The only one that I can think of at this moment in time would be the M9 incident, and that was more around health and safety executive and their expertise in that area.
When you say it was more around the health and safety executive, was there an instruction of expert witnesses in connection with health and safety prosecution?
I believe there was, yes.
And are there any other examples you can think of where medical experts were instructed by PIRC?
No.
In the time until your retiral, were you aware of any other medical experts having been instructed by PIRC?
No.
Can we look at paragraph 548? I have been asked if any rules, guidance, standard operating procedures or case law was considered by PIRC when identifying, selecting and instructing expert witnesses during the investigation. No, there wasn't. Can I ask, was that because there were no rules, guidance, standard operating procedures or case law at that time, or because they did not refer to them?
I'm unaware of any rules, guidance or standing operating procedures in relation to instructing expert witnesses.
What training had investigators had in relation to instructing medical experts?
None, I would imagine. Even as an SIO within policing, I don't ever remember receiving training on how to identify expert witnesses. But during the training that you receive as a senior investigating officer, you're made aware of the type of library, the type of resource that's available through the likes of, in my time, the crime faculty, and then ultimately the College of Policing.
Thank you. Were you aware some of your investigators did not come from a police background?
No, absolutely.
Were you aware if any of them had had training in relation to instructing medical experts?
No, definitely not. They didn't come from that background as far as I'm aware.
Right. I think at paragraph 545, you say you were asked if you were aware of the criteria that were used to select the experts, but you weren't aware of the criteria. Is it fair to say that these issues would be the responsibility of Mr. McSporran?
Yes, indeed, yes.
Yeah. Is this the sort of level of detail that you would have expected to be brought to your attention or to ask you for guidance in connection with?
No, not necessarily, because ultimately Mr. McSporran had the same training as I had in relation to senior investigating officers training, and in a past life I had always relied heavily on the areas that I have discussed today to help identify subject matter experts.
And then at 549, I've been asked if Crown Office provided PIRC with any guidance in relation to the identification, selection and instruction of expert witnesses during the investigation. No, there are responsibilities for the investigators that Crown would rightly turn around and say, well, we've instructed you to do it. Find what you need, send it to us and we'll determine whether it satisfies our needs.
Yes.
Do you, in light of what you've told us today, that in relation to the absence of specific training, perhaps the absence of experience, the absence of guidance and SOPs and such like, Do you feel you had sufficient help from Crown? I appreciate you're running things past them, but do you feel you had sufficient support in identifying the right experts and instructing their opinions?
I don't know that I could say that we were given support from Crown. I don't know if they generally, or I don't recall them generally coming and saying to us, try A, B, C and D. We had an idea of the type of expert opinion that we were looking for, that subject matter experience in relation to drugs and the effect that those drugs might have on an individual, around restraint, all of that. As I said earlier, my concern was that for us to march forward and just assume that we were identifying people who would satisfy Crown's need would have been a folly. It could have held things back enormously, and I thought it was a rational decision to share the CVs, the experience of the persons who supplied those CVs, and get agreement, or otherwise, from Crown that they were prepared to accept expert testimony from these individuals.
Thank you. Can I ask you about a letter? We've actually looked at 2 letters, and I'll just give you some context here, if I may begin. We've heard evidence about 2 letters that were written by Mr. Amar Anwar on the 31st of July 2015. And the first letter was sent to the Chief Constable.
Yes.
And the second letter was sent to PIRC, and specifically to Mr. McSporran and to Kate Free.
Okay.
And ultimately, at some point, the Crown sent the Chief Constable letter to PIRC. So PIRC did have sight of both letters.
Okay.
I wonder if I can ask you to look at COPFS 02768A. There we are. And you'll see that this is a letter to Kate Frey,
yes,
from the Crown Office, dated the 24th of August 2015. There's a reference to section 33A. And it says, I write to ask you to carry out an investigation in relation to the circumstances in relation to attached correspondence from Amar Anwar. If we move down the page, there was an indication they've written to the Deputy Chief Constable to advise them that I've instructed you to take forward the investigation and happy to discuss the foregoing. This is from Mr. Brown at the head of criminal allegations against the police division.
Yes.
And then if we keep going down that page, we'll see what is a 4-page letter from Mr. Anwar to Mr. Stephen House, who was then the Chief Constable.
Yep.
And there are, I don't need to go through the detail of this with you,
Yep.
but there are a number of, we can scan through it actually. We can see that some matters are redacted, but you can see there's references to a number of issues that they are asking PIRC to investigate.
Yes.
I'd like to ask you of your view about the way this information came to PIRC. So rather than the actual content, I'm interested in the fact that if we can go back to the Crown Office letter, what it appears is they're simply asking you to carry out an investigation in relation to a letter which is attached.
Yes.
Was that customary for the Crown to simply put a covering letter on correspondence from solicitors when they were asking you to investigate?
I think maybe that it was simply a matter of ensuring that the concerns raised by Mr. Anwar arrived in our desk exactly as they had been portrayed. Again, that was a decision for Crown, whether they took it and dealt with it that way. It came to the Commissioner. I don't think there was a discussion, or I'm not aware of discussion beforehand, but Crown obviously believed that that was the appropriate manner in which to share that information with the Commissioner.
And we've also heard that this is an example of a letter where the interim report had gone to Crown
Yes.
on the 7th of August. It was a substantial document, 351 pages in length. But after that interim report was sent, further letters of instruction
Yes.
continued to come in. Is that the case?
Yes.
And the further letters of instruction, the expansion, the extension of the terms of reference, that continued over a period of time.
Yes.
And then ultimately, I think the final report was sent the following year.
Okay. Yeah.
Do you remember that?
I don't remember exactly. It was sent the
Roughly
following
a
year.
year
Yes.
later.
I couldn't give you a
Oh.
date, but I know that it was about a year later. Yes.
We heard evidence from Mr. McSporran, and he agreed that it was around August the following year, 2016.
Well, that
So
would be
roughly a
correct.
year after the interim report.
Yes.
Did you continue to have a sort of supportive role of the investigation during that period?
By August 2016, my role had changed
Can you tell
considerably.
us about that?
The Commissioner, Kate Frame, had looked at the setup of the organisation at that time, having been in place now for a couple of years, and believed that support was needed elsewhere in relation to HR facilities, etc. Round about the end of the financial year, so that would be around about March, April 2016, the head of corporate services left the organisation, and there was a slight remodelling undertaken at that time. I then moved from the role of Director of Investigations to a new formed role of Director of Operations, which gave me the responsibility not only for the investigation side of business, but the overarching responsibility for the reviews, the corporate services area of business, and also made me the accountable officer in relation to Scottish Government finance. So my role expanded somewhat. Honestly, I could not possibly at that stage have the same level of interaction with the ongoing investigation that I had previously.
And so was that from, did you say March 2016?
I believe it was, and I think that was the case because I think one of my first duties was to sign off the audit around the end of the financial year and the beginning of the new financial. So it was certainly round about March, April time of 2016.
And so investigations became a smaller part of your overall responsibilities.
My time was shared among a wider responsibility, is the way I would put it. Yes, and Irene Scullion then remained as head of investigations at that stage.
And did her title remain the same?
It remained the same, yes.
But in terms of her role after you took on this Director of Operations role, how did her role evolve at that time?
Well, it didn't really change. It was the same role, and I think I tried, maybe not particularly eloquently earlier, to describe that my role initially, when Professor John McNeill was there, was a role that supported him, who had little knowledge of criminal investigations. And that's why he was keen also to have a deputy to my role, so that when I was supporting him and attended a lot of meetings with him, the work was split between myself and Irene Sculling. I think what would be fair to say is that once we moved to me becoming Director of Operations, in general terms, that day-to-day work fell to Irene Sculling and was not shared by us at that stage.
Now, can we just go back to your inquiry statement, please? Paragraph 39. I just want to be clear in my own mind that I've got the dates correct
Okay.
here. Paragraph 39. So I think you were asked about the Director of Operations room role.
Yeah.
In your inquiry statement, you say sometime in 2017.
Yes, but I've rethought that, and I'm quite sure now that it was 2016.
2016.
Because I'm sorry, I was in that role for longer than a year before I retired, much longer than a year, and I'm now quite sure within my own mind that it was nearer the time frame that I have now described, April, May March, April, May time, 2016.
And I think you said earlier that you retired in 2018.
I did. I retired officially on the 31st of March, the end of March.
And so if you were in that role, Director of Operations, for over a year,
Yeah.
it would have been prior to
Yes.
17, it would have been 2016.
It most certainly was. I was mistaking around the 2017 date.
Thank you. Can I very briefly go back to a matter in relation to the 4th of June? I'm conscious of the time, but this wouldn't take long. We've heard evidence from Mr. McSporran about the arrangements that were made on the 4th of June for the officers to give statements. Yes. And he talked about 2 investigators being allocated to interview each of the officers. There were 9 officers. He talked about regular breaks being set up. Because they anticipated each officer's account would be slightly different. What you might get is one officer mentioning a particular set of circumstances, a specific issue, and another officer doesn't. And that's why you have regular breaks where you discuss these matters. I was there in a coordination role. You may then say, well, can you now go back and ask him about this or ask her about that? And the officer might say, oh yes, that is right, I do remember that now. But you want to get their initial sort of accounts and then go back and examine that in detail and have those regular breaks in discussion with the investigators. I'm interested in your reflections on setting up that sort of mass interview strategy, if you like, on the 4th of June. 9 officers, each requiring 2 investigators or 2 members of staff of PIRC to interview them.
Yes.
Were they all investigators who interviewed them?
Yes.
Can I ask for your comments about the idea of having breaks and cross-referencing between an initial point, such as we've heard evidence that Mr. McSporran and Mr. Little were there, and in a, as Mr. McSporran describes, a coordination role, not interviewing individual officers? Yes,
I'm quite sure it was a challenging day around that, but I can see where he's coming from. All the officers were there together. We did have the resources at that time to conduct interviews with all 9, and to the best of his ability, I've no doubt, Mr. McSporran tried to interpret, to understand the briefs that he was getting from each team and make a decision as to whether certain points would have to be reconsidered, put to other witnesses, and how that worked on that day, as I say, would have been challenging.
Did you have any concerns in relation to your knowledge of the arrangements as to whether there would be any potential for cross-contamination or influencing one witness with references to what another witness had said?
No, because I would have imagined that it would only have been put as a challenge if there was a specific point made which was completely contradicted by another person. I think, moving on, and I also think that part of the reason, as I said earlier, was that there was now an urgency to get initial accounts, at least, from these officers onto paper. Yeah, and it's quite clear that on the 4th, we had sufficient staff to do that. So I think it's been very much a case of, yes, the urgency, let's get that initial interaction with the police, let's get these statements noted, and we happen to have the staff on duty at this present time who can achieve that, because I don't know when that might have happened again.
Thank you. Can you give me a moment, please? I'm conscious of the time.
Take a 15-minute break there. Ms. Graham.
Thank you. Can I ask you some questions? I was asking you questions about experts
Yes.
and the instruction of expert witnesses. I'm interested in Dr. Karch, Stephen Karch,
Okay, yes.
who was instructed. And I asked Mr. McSpadden about this, and I wonder if you have any better recollection
Okay.
about how it came to be that Dr. Karch was identified as a suitable expert.
No, I'm sorry, I don't.
No. Right. Do you remember if he was recommended through the contact with College of Policing or some other source?
I'm afraid I don't know.
Right. Were you party to any discussions or about Dr. Karch and his suitability to identify and opine on issues that PIRC were interested in?
No, I just became aware that he had been selected and that he was being suggested to Crown as alternate, an expert who they may wish to use. I'm sorry that I can't.
No, that's fine. Can we look at your inquiry statement again, please?
Yes.
Paragraphs 574 and then 575. If we look at 574. You were referred to a letter of 12th of October 2015 from the Commissioner. Sorry, can we look at 574 first? Thank you. So from the Commissioner, Kate Frame to the Lord Advocate,
Yep.
concerning expert witnesses. And you were asked to look at a specific part of that letter where it stated Dr. Karch is considered to be one of the world's foremost experts in this field. And you've said expert witnesses tend to tell you that. I doubt that it would be the Commissioner that would find that. Do you know where this information came from?
From about Dr. Karch being
The part in italics, the world's foremost, one of the world's foremost experts in this field.
No, I'm afraid I don't.
And if we can move to 575, you were then referred to a letter of 6th November from Mr. Anwar for the attention of Kate Frame, page 8, which stated, the fact that Dr. Carey refutes the claims by a senior PIRC investigator as to the recommendation of Dr. Karch means that the claims made by the investigator are either a complete distortion of the facts and or a deliberate attempt to steer the investigation in a specific direction. And we've heard some evidence about an issue about the instruction of Dr. Karch, and obviously Mr. Anwar was raising there a concern about a deliberate attempt to steer the investigation in a specific direction. Dr. Karch was instructed and commented on excited delirium
Right, okay.
at that time. So I'm interested, you don't remember how his name came to be recommended to the Crown. Do you have any recollection about where the information was from that PIRC seemed to have, at some point at least, considered him to be one of the world's foremost experts?
I'm trying to place Dr. Karch. Was he the American?
Yes, sorry, I
Right,
perhaps
okay,
should have
sorry,
said that.
yeah.
He was the American.
I think then that there must have been a search in relation to that whole business around excited delirium. Now, I do know that was discussed. I don't know who started that discussion off, and whether that then became one of the search criteria that was undertaken, and I think he was identified via the internet. Now that I realise who Dr. Karch is.
Right. Sorry, that I should have given you more information.
Sorry.
In terms of what was contained within the post-mortem report, can I ask you to look at PIRC 01445? And we'll have that on the screen. Page 17, please. It reads 16 on the actual report, 17 on the PDF. So if we can move up, please, to move up, move down, move down. I'd like the screen to be brought. Do you see the number 17 there?
Yes.
It's getting late in the afternoon. I apologise. You see the 17 there? I want 16. Thank you so much. And if we can look at the paragraph, which is slightly further down, which begins, given the circumstances. Here we are.
Yes.
Given the circumstances provided. So this is a report written by Dr. Shearer
Okay.
and Dr. Buhadir, who are the pathologists that
initial
carried out
yes,
the
yes.
post-mortem. And they say, given the circumstances provided, toxicological findings and lack of another cause of death at post-mortem, the possibility of excited delirium syndrome has been considered in this case. It is, however, a psychiatric and not a pathological diagnosis. And there is some debate in the forensic community with regards to its application as a cause of death. I'm not going to ask you about your views on that. We've heard evidence about this
Yes.
aspect. That said, there is a great deal of literature looking at this syndrome, especially with regards to the circumstances described in this case. But it has to be remembered that it should be considered in conjunction with circumstantial information, namely a history of restraint and toxicological findings. And then there's more, another paragraph about excited delirium syndrome and the circumstances around that. What Dr. Shearer and her colleague are saying here is that they have considered excited delirium syndrome, but it is a psychiatric and not a pathological diagnosis.
Yes.
And there is some debate in the forensic community regarding its application to cause of death.
Yes.
And we have heard evidence about that debate and some up-to-date information about views taken by various bodies. What this report appears to say is that this would be a psychiatric matter. And was it your impression that Dr. Karch was a psychiatrist? We've heard that he has an interest in cardiac pathology.
Okay. No, I didn't think that he
No.
was a psychiatrist. But this is exactly the set of circumstances that I considered when deciding to approach Crown to make sure that they were comfortable with the selection of specialist witnesses. You know, for them to decide whether or not that should have been progressed.
And so is that something you expected the Crown to have input into, whether Dr. Karch was suitable here to express an opinion?
Yes.
And from what you're saying, is it fair to say that to some extent PIRC were reliant on the approval or views of Crown before they instructed experts?
Yes, I think that would be right, because ultimately, Crown being the decision makers at the end of the day, I would not have considered it appropriate to send them information which did not assist their determinations.
So if PIRC, as you did, put forward Dr. Karch's name, if Crown had said, we don't think he's suitable to express an opinion, for whatever reason, is that something that PIRC would have taken on board?
Yes,
and simply
yes.
not instructed him?
Yes.
So without the Crown approval, no one would have been instructed, is that fair to say?
Yes, we would probably have had to start again and look for other expert witnesses. Yeah, that's absolutely the case, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you. And did you hear, or were you aware of an issue that had arisen with Dr. Carey, attributing to Dr. Carey some favourable comments regarding Dr. Kerr?
Yes, I think I was aware of that, yes.
And we've heard evidence from Mr. Harrower about that matter. Do you have any recollection about the circumstances of that that could help us?
Only that, from memory again, that Mr. Harrower, I believe, visited with Dr. Carey
We've
in
heard
relation
evidence
to
that he
expert,
dropped off
yes,
samples.
yes,
Yes.
histology samples and the likes, as far as I can remember.
And that there's certain correspondence indicating that Dr. Carey made favourable comments about Dr. Karch,
Yeah.
but that was subsequently disputed by Dr. Carey. Can you tell us any recollection about your involvement with resolving that matter?
No, I don't, other than I think at the end of the day the decision was made to discount
Right.
Mr. Karch. I don't remember any more detail than that, I'm afraid.
That's fine. You make a comment in your statement at one point that a report may have been produced but discounted
Yeah.
by Dr. Karch. What do you mean by discounted?
Well, I think it may. I believe that he supplied a document giving some form of expert opinion, which then was shared with the Crown, because I don't think we could have done anything else with that. And I think at that stage, from memory again, the Crown decided not to proceed. That's my memory.
At any point were PIRC expressing views on the expert opinions that you'd received? Or was that a matter for the Crown?
I think that was a matter for Crown, and again, my experience is that if Crown had concerns or questions, the process normally went to recognition of expert witnesses, from my experience.
So in terms of PIRC's role, you were identifying experts, sending the names and CVs to the Crown for consideration. If approval was obtained, you would then instruct them.
Yes.
We've heard evidence that an expert witness package was prepared.
Yes.
I think in your inquiry statement, you say that was the first time an expert witness package had been prepared for that purpose. It was sent to the experts. They would return their opinions as requested.
Yes.
Was any analysis done by PIRC, or was that simply then forwarded to the Crown?
No, I think, and in fact I'm sure that SI would have read those reports, but they would then be passed to Crown. I don't have any experience at all in almost 27 years as a detective ever having gone and challenged an expert opinion from a witness. That, as I say, tends to be a role that Crown would undertake through the recognition process.
So any questions or challenges or even consulting with an expert, would that be for the Crown?
Yes, I would suggest so.
So the PIRC role was about getting the opinions in.
Yes.
Certainly Mr. Mixborn reading them,
Yeah.
and then sending them to the Crown for their analysis.
Form part of the overall package of evidence gathered.
Thank you. We have, there's some evidence available to the Chair about Dr. Karch having been contacted by the press, and I'd like to ask you about that. 581 of your inquiry statement, please. So that's 581. And you see it says, I've been referred to an article in the Scottish Sun on Sunday the 1st of November 2015, in which Dr. Karch was quoted to say, with reference to Mr. Bio, I can tell you that I saw evidence of heart disease. I think I do remember that, yes. I don't know if we did respond to it. So this was a quote from Dr. Karch in the Scottish Sun. And by November, the interim report's gone to the Crown, and 582 says, I've been referred to a letter dated 4th November 2015, so 3 days later, that I sent to Les Brown. He was the head of the crimes against the police, the allegations.
Criminal allegations against the police department within Crown.
he refers to this article. I have been asked if this letter to Crown Office drew a line under matters from my perspective. I think it did. It would be wonderful if we could stop newspapers writing things that we don't like. But you've got to be surprised that someone like PIRC even made any sort of comment, albeit he claims he was taken off guard and stopped immediately. If we can move just back up to the top of that paragraph, I'm interested in a couple of things here. First of all, when PIRC instructed experts, was there any part of the process or procedure where it was explained to them that they should be keeping matters confidential?
Yes, I think there was. I believe that was part in it, as anyone who is an expert witness and has experience of that should aware that speaking to newspapers during an investigation is just not appropriate.
And did that also apply to people from America? They have a slightly different relationship with the press in America.
Okay, that's a point. I don't know whether he was specifically told that he should not speak with the press. I don't know. That would have been appropriate, I think, now when you mention the difference in the relationship between expert witnesses here and press, and they know what's expected of them, and that might be a completely different set of circumstances.
Right.
Still not the sort of thing I would honestly have expected an expert witness to have mentioned in a newspaper.
And you certainly say that you were surprised that
Yes.
he'd made a remark. And in relation to, obviously this came to light in November, what steps did PIRC take to address the family, or to draw this to their attention, or to alleviate any concerns they had?
I'm not 100% sure, but I know by then that Mr. Anwar, on behalf of the family, had corresponding and was corresponding with Crown. I don't know whether we tried to inform the family that this matter should never have appeared like that. I don't, I'm sorry.
But certainly from what you said today, this was not something you were comfortable with.
No, I wasn't comfortable with it at all.
After this came to light and Dr. Karch was quoted in the paper, was any action taken by PIRC to either speak publicly about the matter or to deal with the matter with Dr. Karch?
I think he was contacted and told that it was inappropriate.
Right. What about speaking, PIRC speaking or making a statement in the media themselves about this matter?
No, I don't think we did.
Was there any reason why that wasn't done?
It was clearly just a decision not to take that line.
In terms of decisions about what to do,
Yeah.
whether to say anything in the media, who would be responsible for taking those decisions?
Ultimately, the Commissioner.
So it may be that Ms. Frame can
Yes.
assist us with that. Finally, in relation to instruction of experts, there was an invitation made to the family and their legal representative to identify additional expert witnesses that may assist PIRC in their investigation.
Yes.
Was it common for PIRC to invite the families or their lawyers to suggest
I think it was
experts?
Crown that made that offer.
Right. And let's look at, I don't know if we'll have this on the playlist for today, PIRC 01835A. Zero 1835A. No, we can maybe come back to that tomorrow.
Okay.
In general, was it customary to if there was a lawyer involved for the family, for example, to invite them to comment on the experts who were instructed?
I don't have any experience of that whatsoever, to be quite honest with you. The majority of the investigations that I was involved in, Flo's spoke with families direct. I think in this set of circumstances, Mr. Anwar would have a better knowledge of that area of investigation than maybe families in general.
And when you say a better knowledge of that area, are you talking about medical experts and
Expert witnesses in general.
Expert witnesses in general. We're talking about the 5 principles under
Yes.
Article 2. Sorry, you were going to say
No.
something. And I was going to... we've been dealing with adequacy and effectiveness.
Yep.
Looking back now, from your perspective as Director of Investigations, were you satisfied personally that the investigation was effective and adequate?
My knowledge of the investigation at the time was, yes, I was content. Without, as you appreciate, having read every statement or viewed every document, I felt that an adequate investigation had been conducted.
And in light of the things that I've drawn to your attention today, has that confidence been dented in any way?
In some ways, there are certainly aspects of the investigation which could have been considered again and maybe revisited.
Right, thank you. I'd like to move on to the third principle, the third aspect, which was it has to be reasonably prompt.
Yes.
So I'd like to ask you some questions about delay or possible delays. We've heard evidence about the timing of arrival of PIRC at Kirkcaldy Police Office.
Yes.
We know that PIRC were officially contacted at 9:35 in the morning
Yes.
by David Green from Crown Office.
Yes.
And they did not arrive in Kirkcaldy Police Office until 1:30. We've heard that after the PIRC were instructed, that the investigators gathered in, I think it was Hamilton at the time, collected cars, some may have collected kit, and they were briefed. I'm wondering what your thoughts are in relation to that period of time that it took between 9:35 and 1:30 on the 3rd of May.
I would expect that they arrive on scene as quickly as they possibly could. Now, allowing for travel time even to Kirkcaldy, we're talking about 4 hours, I think, by you know, I do remember asking why it took so long. I do, and I do believe that part of it was calling out others and getting access to motor vehicles which were parked at Hamilton office. I mean, in an ideal world, they would have gone straight from their homes, but I don't necessarily know whether that would be practical or otherwise.
We've heard a suggestion that we've heard that the investigators arrived together, but we've heard a suggestion in evidence that a lead investigator can turn up at an incident on their own while they wait for the team to arrive. Have you any views on that?
Yes, why not, would be my point around that. I go back to a point I made earlier in relation to a call out I received about a police shooting. I knew that other members of the organisation were making their way there. I went straight there. I live in Ayrshire. The incident occurred in Ayrshire. I was handy. I don't even think I was on call, but when I heard about it, I thought that it was appropriate that I step in and assist. And indeed, the on-call senior that day was Ricky Casey, and I told him to attend immediately at the PIM suite, along with 2 other investigators, one, to ensure that the PIM was instructed about conferring, and two, to ungather whatever productions there were at that time. Again, that's the way I dealt with it. So I suppose what I'm saying is that would be my expectation of others.
And say, for example, you had an investigator, not necessarily a lead investigator or a senior investigator, but an investigator who lived close to the police office. What about the possibility that they speak to the lead investigator and offer to go themselves? Is that something you would hesitate to do?
Yeah, it's not necessarily. I would be far more content with the lead investigator speaking directly with whoever from Police Scotland was there and was assuming responsibility and charge, to have a conversation about what the senior investigator's expectations were and get an agreement and the confirmation that that was understood. Because ultimately, we're talking about the length and breadth of Scotland here. There are occasions where early arrival would be almost impossible. But then I would expect them to get there as quickly as they could.
And when you're describing a conversation with the, say, the SIO from Police Scotland, if there was to be an agreement, are you talking about providing that officer, senior investigating officer, with some expectation of when you would arrive?
Yes.
At PIRC?
Yes. So for example, I want the scene of this incident maintained. I want uniformed officers to circle it. I don't want anything moved. I want you to understand that that is my instruction and confirm that you will adhere to that, and we will get there as soon as we can.
And in terms of sharing that information, we'll get there as soon as we can. Would you expect the investigator to say that will be round about a certain time? Either an hour, 2 hours?
I think that would
3
be
hours?
reasonable, because I think that the senior officer on the other end of the phone would probably at least ask that question. How long will you be?
We've heard comments made that some people have expressed the view that it's more difficult to direct an investigation remotely than if you're at the scene or at the location. Would you agree with those comments?
Yes, but it doesn't preclude giving instruction before you arrive.
Can I ask for your views on, we've heard that Senior Investigator Casey remained in the PIRC office that day. I've already asked you about this, but was there any reason that you're aware of why he could not have taken on the role of lead investigator?
None.
We've heard evidence that another set of hands might have bolstered resources. And I think from what you said earlier, you probably agree with that.
Yes, definitely. The more people that we could have mustered and sent there, the better.
Right. And then again, thinking about reasonable promptness, can I ask you about the timing of PIRC's arrival at Victoria Hospital? So we've heard evidence that the investigators did not arrive at Victoria Hospital where Mr. Bio was to attend the body until 1900 hours that evening. Do you have any concerns about that period of time?
Again, I think there could have been a quicker response.
And when you say quicker, can you help the chair understand what you mean by quicker?
Well, to get there as quickly as you possibly could to take control and to remove the police presence there. I would have, and I believe that that's what happened, that a scene manager was sent. And I don't wish to be insensitive here, but Mr. Bio's remains were going to be very, very important in relation to forensic examination. So a scene manager was the right person to send there. Now whether, and I don't recall whether there was a challenge in getting a scene manager, I'm not sure, but that didn't mean that we couldn't have sent someone else. The best would have been a scene manager.
Right. So even if there were challenges in obtaining someone who was trained in crime scene management,
Yes.
If there was going to be a delay until 1900 hours in the evening, would your expectations have been that someone else would have been sent as an interim
I would have
measure?
preferred that that was the case.
Is that what you would have expected your investigators to arrange?
Yes.
And the timing of arrival at Hayfield Road, we've heard evidence that PIRC did not arrive at Hayfield Road where the incident occurred until 1920 hours.
Yeah.
Again, thinking about the time scale from the moment of appointment of
Yeah.
PIRC, do you have any concerns about that period?
More concerned about the hospital time than the actual Hayfield Road, because my understanding of Hayfield Road is that by the time we were even involved, there had been an ambulance on scene, that Mr. Bayo had clearly been taken to hospital, that things that we would have been interested in, like the knife, for example, had already been recovered. So, yes, again, to get an understanding of how the scene looked, and maybe to start considering what would be appropriate for house to house. But I would have been less concerned about the scene because of the circumstances than I was about the hospital.
Thank you. Less concerned, yes, but in terms of the actual time it took to
I would have preferred that they had been there sooner.
And again, can you help the chair understand what you mean when you say sooner?
Well, again, as quickly as without undue delay.
And if there were any issues in having someone with crime scene experience attend Hayfield Road, would you have expected that someone else would be sent there as an interim measure?
Yes, that would be appropriate.
Can I ask, do you agree that you were asked at paragraphs 185 and 186 about evidence that SIO Campbell had given? And am I right in thinking you agree that the death message should be passed to the family as soon as possible?
Absolutely.
So you're asked about this in your inquiry statement. And do you agree that it should be done by a police officer?
Yes.
And not a flow?
Yes.
Can you explain why that's your view?
Well, first and foremost, as soon as the police know the identity of Mr. Bayo, I believe that the family should have been informed of his death. Yeah. Now, it might not always be a flow that is available, but in any case, it doesn't need to be a flow who delivers the death message. The role of the flow is to support the family and let the family understand processes, procedures, what's going to happen next, and that's what their special training is about. It's not about being chosen to deliver death messages.
We've heard it suggested that sometimes it can be a disadvantage if the flow does deliver a death message because the family associate receiving bad
Yes,
news.
yes, I'm aware that that has been said, and I've heard that feedback from flows during my time in the police, and indeed it was during that type of feedback that the decision was made that where possible it should not be the flow that delivers that, just for the reason that you've given there is that bad connotation thereafter.
Thank you. So again, is this an area where PIRC are reliant on Police Scotland to have delivered that?
Yes, the police are there. I think there is an importance that the family are told and that there is no undue delay in that matter.
And so would that be envisaged, that delivery of the death message, to have occurred perhaps before PIRC have even arrived at the office or where the incident is?
Yes, I would say that if the identity of the deceased was known, that as soon as that had been established, that the family members should be informed of the death.
Thank you. Can we look at paragraph 186 of your inquiry statement? We have police flows initially because they're there and available, and that's one area that I do agree with Pat Campbell in relation to. So we've heard evidence that there are Police Scotland flows, but there are also PIRC flows. We've heard some evidence from Mr. Lewis, who I think was a PIRC flow.
He was, yes. Or he is, sorry, I think.
He is. They have the staff that are available to them to get flows in there, to explain the process around identification and to explain to families the circumstances as they are known at that time. Although the police would have taken the initial approach to the family, in due course that responsibility would be handed over to PIRC as investigators, who would then appoint flows who would continue that liaison with the family.
Yes.
I'd like to ask you for your thoughts on the idea that officers deliver the death message, then there are police flows, and then there's a handover to PIRC flows. Is that the most efficient and effective way of supporting the family?
Yes, I believe so, because I think that it's important that, again, that the family are provided with the information that is known at the earliest juncture. And as it stands as it stood in 2015, I'm not quite sure how quickly we could have stood the flows up to provide that information. I know that there was a push to have a post-mortem conducted. I think it's absolutely appropriate that if there are trained flows, police officers or otherwise, available to go and to support the family as early on in those processes as possible, that is good practice. The reason that you would then change that is, again, around independence. So you would introduce flows from PIRC when they became available.
We've heard that in the circumstances on the 3rd of May, that there were concerns within the family about the information that was shared by the police during the delivery of death messages.
Yes.
And there were a number of messages given. And there was a view taken that the family's concern was of such, it was such a great concern that sending Police Scotland flows would not have assisted. And so Police Scotland decided not to deploy Police Scotland flows. Do you have any comments on that? Have you experienced a similar situation yourself where there's been an issue about Police Scotland flows being delivered?
No,
deployed, I should say.
Again, I think Mr. Harrow it would be, who was at the
He's given evidence.
Yeah,
yes.
I think that he believed that police flows were going to be deployed to the family. I think it came as quite a surprise to him later on in the day when he learned that that hadn't occurred. Now, I don't see why that's a problem, unless the family have categorically said that they do not want any further contact with the police at that time because of the way that they felt that they have been dealt with. I think I would still have sent flows along to offer whatever support they could. The caveat to that is so long as that didn't make the situation worse for the family.
So it would really be what would be in the family's best interest?
Absolutely. I think I mentioned it, and it was a flow giving an input after a bombing in London. And the point that that very experienced flow made was that it's very, very difficult at the time of death to make things better for the family. But it is very easy if you get it wrong to make it worse. So ultimately, I think it has to be what the family want.
And I think in paragraph 188, you explained to the chair, and in 189, reasons why you think Police Scotland flows would have been better deployed, and you mentioned speed, availability, possibly experience, possibly religion or gender. Are those the reasons why you think Police Scotland flows?
Yes,
might be better than
I
PIRC?
think that those are the component parts of what you'd be looking at, but I just think that they would have been better deployed unless the family specifically said no, to give the support to the family that they needed at that time. And that was probably particularly in relation to the arrangement of a post-mortem.
Do you personally have experience of situations where the family have been perhaps concerned about engaging with flows or reluctant, and means by which they could be persuaded or encouraged to engage with flows?
Yes, sometimes there are challenges around that in homicide investigations where, particularly in relation to murders relating to serious and organised crime groups, where they have no interest in the police or speaking to the police at all. However, a flow also has a very important role as investigator. So yes, you do try to win trust. You try to get the family on board. It's not always easy and it doesn't always work. And again, you then have to consider, is this doing more damage than it is good?
So there are also benefits to the investigation if a flow is engaged with the family.
Most definitely, most definitely.
Looking back now, from what you know of the situation with the flows, you've talked in previous situations about what's best practice. I'm interested in your views on what best practice would have been here for deployment of PIRC flows.
Well, I think what would have been best here is that the death message is delivered by a non-flow police officer. That the police flows then move in, support the family and explain the processes around moving towards post-mortem, and also explain to the family that Crown have directed an independent body, PIRC, to investigate the death, and that flows from that independent body will in time take over from the police. And then, as soon as practicable, arrange for flows to meet the family direct and try and build some sort of understanding, rapport, trust with the family.
And we've heard from others that there could be a handover or a meeting between the Police Scotland flows effectively introducing the PIRC flows. Was that something you would...
If that was appropriate under the circumstances, but again, I think you would have to consider every circumstance in its own merit.
Now, as well as thinking about individual elements about arrival at events or incidents, can I ask you overall in relation to the delivery of the, first of all, the interim report?
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts about thinking of reasonable promptness still? Do you have any views on the initial interim report, which was the 7th of August 2015? That was when it was delivered
Yes.
to Crown.
I think that's as soon as it could be delivered, because ultimately it had to contain sufficient evidence and information to inform Crown of where the investigation was at that stage. So I think that was the appropriate time.
And can I also then ask you about the final report, which
Yes.
we've heard that the terms of reference were expanded and extended after delivery of the interim report, and it was around another year before the final report was delivered. You've also explained this was at a time when resources were, can I say, stretched
Yes.
in PIRC. What are your views about the delivery of the final report and promptness?
There was constant contact between the investigators and Crown Office. Again, from memory, Crown wanted a report that was full, that covered all of their recent instruction. And I don't think they wanted piecemeal reports So ultimately, yes, for all the reasons that you've just spoken about there, the increased number of directions from Crown in relation to new lines of investigation, that all took time. And you are right in saying that there were other challenges around staffing at that stage.
All right, thank you. Can I ask you about the fourth principle that we're looking at in terms of an Article 2 investigation, which was the public scrutiny
Yes.
element? And I wonder if I can begin by asking you, we've heard evidence that the PIRC report in a Crown-led investigation, such as Mr. Bio's death, is effectively ownership of the report is with the Crown.
Yes.
It is their report, and what they do with it is a matter for them.
Yes.
But obviously, with your experience, I'm interested in whether you think there might be merit in allowing Police Scotland to see that report, to allow them to learn lessons or have regard to issues that have been flagged up during the PIRC investigation. Do you have any thoughts on that yourself?
Yes, I think that would be worthwhile, but again, that would have to be delivered by Crown, or alternatively, Crown would have to give us express permission to do that.
Right.
And so far as I'm aware, that was not the case in Mr. Bio's death.
And we've heard that for a Chief Constable in a referred investigation, the situation is different.
It is different.
And am I right in saying we've heard evidence that the PIRC report can be published
Yes.
by PIRC, or parts of it can
Yes.
be published? Do you see any benefit in terms of public scrutiny of the work of PIRC, but also investigations into the police, in having reports made public?
Yes, I do. I think there's that openness, there is that transparency. I don't know whether Crown consider that in Mr. Bio's death that maybe if that was going to go to a fatal accident inquiry, or whether at some stage it may even lead to criminal charges, whether that would be the public scrutiny, or here we are now, the public scrutiny. So it's a difficult one, but as it stands, the position with Crown, unless that has changed in the 6 years whilst I have retired, that without the express permission of the Crown, we would not share the contents of a Crown-directed investigation with anyone else. Now that, even if you're going to involve the Health and Safety Executive or the Office of the Surveillance Commissioner or Information Commissioner, that you would look to get that agreement from Crown that you were expressly permitted to share certain information.
We can certainly say with confidence that prior to the commencement of this inquiry and leading evidence from the first witnesses to this inquiry, no evidence had ever been laid in a courtroom or an inquiry
No,
of any sort.
absolutely.
There was never an FEI.
No.
So there had not been that opportunity to hear the evidence or
No.
to allow the public to consider that.
No.
So in circumstances where the death and the investigation took place in 2015, there's never been any FEI or inquiry of any
No.
sort until this inquiry started. Do you think there is benefit in having, if there had been an opportunity, in having the PIRC report published or made available more publicly?
I honestly don't know whether I can answer that question, because I think the way the legislation is framed, that is a decision wholly for the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service.
Thank you. I'm going to move on actually to another aspect of public scrutiny that I'd like to speak to you about, but I'm conscious it's now nearly 1:15.
Yes, well, we'll stop there today and adjourn till 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.